Before we dive in, I'll give a little bit of background on Stainless because we got to give our spiel. Stainless is a company that generates SDKs, MCP servers, and soon, API docs for any REST API. So we take in your open API spec and we do all of that. We produce the SDKs for OpenAI, Anthropic, Cloudflare, Knock, and a bunch of other great companies. Without further ado, I'll let everybody introduce yourselves, if that works.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm Matt. I work at Stripe on our developer AI team and Docs.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Knock.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dina. I'm a product manager on Cloudflare's developer platform.
And my name is Brooke. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Vantage.
Everybody here has been building and rolling out MCP servers recently. So Stripe has, mcp.stripe.com. Knock has a few different features, bits of functionality. We'll talk about all of that soon. Cloudflare has a lot going on, both in terms of their own MCP servers and a lot of tools to support developers who are building their own MCP offerings. And Vantage has an exciting MCP server as well, and some other stories to share. So I'm going to start things off with a little bit of my perspective on what MCP is all about, where it tends to be used, where it's a little bit less useful. We had actually, coincidentally, someone from the community posted an article that we wrote to Hacker News yesterday. And so if you saw MCP is eating the world and you thought, oh, that's a stupid clickbait headline, I'm so sorry. And if you actually read the content, it was better than the Hacker News discussion. Subjective take. But we are actually seeing real use cases both inside of our company and a lot of other companies. And so we're going to talk about that. One of the big areas that I see MCP used most often, and just to define the term a little bit, Model Context Protocol, it's a way for tools and resources to interact with LLM models. Raise your hand if you knew that. Okay, good. That was my expectation. So if you need a deeper explanation, turn to the person next to you. We're probably going to be pretty technical tonight in general. So use case number one that I tend to see is basically documentation. So the client in this case is going to be Cursor or some other Copilot application where you're building something and you want help building that thing. So for example, maybe I'm a developer integrating with Stripe for the first time, and I just want my editor to basically write my integration for me. And my editor, has AI, but it needs to know the latest and greatest from the Stripe documentation site. And so that sort of docs, what I call docs use case is really prevalent. We'll hear more about it. Another is exposing an API to a chat interface, right? So I'm chatting with some LLM, and I want that LLM to go get information or do stuff for me. And so that, API for chat is sort of like what I personally call that use case. A lot of people, when they learned about MCP, would also think about API for code, where you're writing an API call to an LLM in your Python code or your TypeScript code or whatever, before you would have done tool calls for that. And after, would you use MCP for that? Most people would still use tool calls. And so that's not a use case we're probably going to talk about a lot today. There are times when you would want MCP for that as well. But mostly when I talk about MCP for the API, I'm still talking about that through the chat, kind of highly dynamic situation. And then the last one is just for internal development, for people who, this is sort of an amalgamation of the other two, but hey, I'm a developer inside of a company and I just want help interacting with stuff inside of my company, sort of an internal copilot. So that's how I personally think about dividing up the world, but we're going to start off not actually talking about the MCP servers that everybody here is building, but I'm really curious to learn more about inside of the companies, inside of the teams that you're on. How are you seeing people using MCP or not, using tools today? Let's start with Matt.
Yeah, so actually, Alistair is here from Stripe as well, but he works on our internal MCP efforts. So we have this thing called Toolshed, which allows any team to contribute different tools. And so like right now, that's still early on, but people can build their own like custom agents on top of that. So you could imagine like if a finance team wants to build like tools around like querying data sets and like answering questions about that. As a developer, I feel like most of it is reading our internal documentation set or like looking up PRs or reading like up-to-date code from SourceGraph. But I think like we'll see more use cases as time goes on.
Yeah, for us, we have a couple of interesting use cases. I think like on our sales team, we've seen adoption of our MCP server to help them basically like learn the product. Like, how can I bootstrap resources using it? How can I like create things within NOC and do that much more easily? And then the other use case we've been seeing a lot is actually in our like kind of solutions engineering side as well. So helping customers out. We have a search documentation tool. We use that to help us with cursor prompts to actually write all of these kind of solution documents as well, and like bring in that context from the doc, making sure that what we're actually bringing into the solutions doc that we're writing for our customers is not some hallucination, right? So it's using like the real documentation and actually retrieving that live. So yeah, they're two of the interesting use cases we see.
Yeah, ours is kind of similar to what Chris was saying, where we have a developer platform and not everybody is technical at our company. And so it's been cool that it's opened up the door for anybody to be able to use our products, which before were maybe very intimidating. But now everybody's like, wow, I can deploy a website and I've never touched code before in my life. So definitely that's one big advantage. But we also have a lot of internal tools that help the sales team get information about different deals, customers, to look up different information. And so, of course, we've had those as applications that internal employees have been using. But now we're building MCP servers around all of these different tools. And then we also are building our own in-house MCP client to make sure that, one, all of that data stays in-house, but also that there's one interface that people can go to and interact with any information that they need across different services, service providers that we might be using.
We're relatively small, 60-person company, so most of the information is still at your fingertips, but shuffling information between systems is pretty interesting. And so as an example, we do an infrastructure spend review at the end of every month using our own platform, but the meeting notes and the agenda for the meeting is all in Notion. And so you can take information out of our platform via the MCP, and then after you've massaged it, you can then have it create a page in Notion automatically. So just automating what previously would have been a fairly manual task. And again, just like a lot of information Notion, a lot of information Slack, a lot of information Vantage, and just kind of moving it between the different systems.
Well, so let's talk a little bit more about, what you guys are building. What are the MCP servers that you've shipped to people out there in the world, to your customers, and how it's being used, right? Probably built a bunch of stuff, maybe expected one thing to happen, maybe people are using it a different way. What are you seeing in terms of what percentage of your use cases are docs versus API, what one tool versus another? How many tools are you exposing? What clients are people using your MCP server through? Tell us what you're seeing. Maybe let's come the other way.
Yeah, so main use case, we have customers interacting with the structured data that's in our platform, and the structured data that's in our platform is mostly about your infrastructure spend. And then there's data sets on top of that, like forecasts, anomalies, performance against budget, things like that. If you're very familiar with that data set, you can log into our interface very quickly, get at the information you want to very quickly. However, if you've ever seen billing data, it gets quite esoteric in terms of like, I was charged from data transfer from this region to that region. How do I know if that belongs to my team or not? Should I be looking at it amortized or undiscounted? So that's the main use case. They can interact with the LLM, and the LLM can direct them to what to query for, and then also show that information in the interface. I think lucky for us, all of that was covered via the API already. And so it was nice to be able to just build the MCP. And right now, it's I think all of the tools are just one-to-one to an API endpoint. I'd say it's like 20% coverage, but that's probably being a little generous. Sorry, what was right now it's read only, although we do have ambitions to add the write component to that as well. And so maybe you're querying the data, you then want to create elements in our platform or update a budget or update and alert, we want to be able to enable that as well. And so for someone who's maybe not the core manager of the platform, it just exposes a lot of our functionality in a much more easy to use way, which happens to be natural language, but that's been the core so far.
So at Cloudflare, we have three kind of segments of our products. One which is our core CDN, making your website faster and more secure. One which is Zero Trust for different companies that want to secure their internal network. And then one which is our developer platform. And we've created 13, I think maybe now 15 MCP servers that span across these different segments. But probably our number one most used MCP server is definitely for just querying our documentation. But definitely a lot more in our developer platform. A lot of these are read-only tools for being able to query databases, being able to query your traffic analytics. This is where it's nice to sometimes use something like Claude to be able to analyze that data, to be able to also ask it to go find errors and then be able to fix them and then be able to deploy the code to fix it. And so we are seeing that most of the tools that are being used are more definitely developer platform coming from Claude, Cursor, VS Code. And we probably have 1,500 unique users that have used MCP in the last month. But yeah.
Nice. For us, so we are a product and customer messaging infrastructure company. So we help companies basically power their product notifications. So our MCP server basically wraps our management API, which is like a layer that you can interact with. You can do everything you can do in our dashboard via our management API. So we pretty much tried to do the read and write case in one with that management API. So we have a whole load of tools that cover most of the functionality, although we've really slimmed down some of the use cases that you can do there. And then our MCP server also wraps our public API as well. So there's also use cases for us, things like invoking a workflow, which is orchestrating notifications and things like that. So in total, we have I think it's about 30 tools. One of the most interesting use cases we have, though, is that you can take your workflows that you build within NOC and actually expose them as tools via the MCP server as well. They're like mini APIs that define the data that they're allowed to have. So that can really blow up the number of tools that are exposed if you have a whole bunch of workflows. So we have ways to deal with that as well. But generally, most of our usage has been in Cursor. Most of the IDEs right now, just in terms of what people are using, very, very developer-centric use cases. But yeah, really interesting kind of adoption and migration use cases that I'd love to touch on as well.
Yeah, so Stripe is a payments infrastructure company. I think also a lot of our usage has been developer-centric. We have one tool that's search documentation, and then we have around 20 other tools that we picked based on the most used actions. So creating prices, creating products, and these are all things that you need to set up when you are creating a Stripe integration. There's also some other stuff in there finalizing invoices and creating subscriptions, listing customers and things like that. But right now, most of the use cases have been around quickly creating products and prices, basically resources you need to set up a Stripe integration. I think we also have around 1,500 users that have used it so far. But I definitely think as we go forward, more and more people will be interested in the querying aspect of it. And so I think that's where it's interesting. We have a product called Sigma that we're putting an API around. So I think it'll be interesting to query your Stripe data through Stripe MCP.
And so, for example, in that case, sort of similar to the top use case we see with Vantage, people would type in and say, hey, how many payments did I process last month? And the LLM would write a little SQL query and execute that against your production data, something like that.
Yeah, and I think it kind of works right now, but I think the classic example we've been thinking of is what's my MRR? And there's a bunch of ways to calculate that. But yeah, that's why we want to kind of have a higher order API around it, kind of our search documentation thing that is able to parse that and look at the canonical template for MRR or something like that. But yeah.
It's funny, we were talking earlier and Brooke shared okay, well, we one of the things that's really great about what we do is we expose all this data, make it easier for people to analyze it. But the problem is that you're doing it through an LLM, and sometimes LLMs are bad at math. And so I don't know, this is a little bit orthogonal, but I'm curious if this is an area that you guys have thought about. Does it make sense to be exposing a lot of API data without computer use also available, for example?
Yeah, it's kind of funny for Stripe because like amount is in like the cents. And so like surprisingly we haven't seen the errors where it's like it tries to create something that's like for $40. But very occasionally we'll see it like makes it for 40 cents instead. So that's like an area where it's like LLMs are dumb. So stuff like that is always scary.
Is that why I think you mentioned earlier, you can create a product in your Stripe account. Say you want to sell a shirt or something, you can say, hey, we sell blue shirts, but you can't create a payment yet through the MCP server. Is it because of these sorts of concerns?
Yeah, so like when you create like a price or a product for that, you can specify like this is $5, and based on the description it reads, it usually does get that right. But just because of how nascent MCP is, that's why we haven't put like money movement flows directly into it yet.
Cool. And when rolling this out to your customer base, I'm just curious if folks have, not in any order, if anyone has like the biggest surprise that they encountered. People were doing totally crazy things you didn't expect, or were totally not using features that you thought were going to be really awesome.
Can I start? So I think one of our most surprising use cases was actually this like migration use case. So if you've got like, let's say you've got like 100 email templates and you have them all in your backend today, and you want to migrate into Knock. Our MCP server basically allows people now to take a directory of emails we've helped like customers write prompts to do this, and then they'll create a Knock workflow and update a template for every single one of those emails that they already have. But beyond that, it calls other tools as well. It can factor out like email layouts. It can understand like shared partials, so like shared components within their emails, and factor those out at the same time. So that, like we have one, this is my only customer anecdote for the day, I promise. But we had one customer go from saying that it was going to take them a quarter to do that, to move like hundreds of email templates. And they did it in a week using the MCP server and this prompt with a load of tool calls, admittedly, but it worked and it got them there, and it got them like 90% of the way, and then they massaged the rest. So that's been incredible for us, and has been like a real game changer to help, like smooth out the onboarding curve for a tool that, it's not easy when you're thinking about those kind of brownfield migrations. So yeah, it's been great for us.
I think one thing that we've seen that MCP has enabled is it's really hard to build integrations within your own products, within different services. And so it was kind of amazing that we could create a tool that could query your analytics. And so it could query those across, let's say, all of your workers that you deployed, something that sometimes is hard to view at that high level view, and then be able to get that data and then automatically say, hey, do you want me to deploy this firewall rule, or do you want me to do this thing? And it's something that I think for a really long time, even people that have worked at Cloudflare for a long time couldn't look at that and be like, yep, that's exactly what you need to do. But all of a sudden, it chained all of our products together, and it was like, whoa, you can do even more with it. So I think that was really neat. And lots of people have been using it to be like, what projects do I have that are not being used at all? Can I like go and delete those?
Is Cloudflare happy about that?
Well, free up some space to build something new.
Great.
I'd say for us, it's maybe change thinking on long-term strategy, where like one of the things we've been asked for a while is like, I actually want you to inject yourself into my developer workflows, either while they're writing code in their IDE or in the pull request level, and like, tell me how that's going to affect my costs. And we just deferred it for so long because it's just not like building a VS Code plugin or injecting ourselves in a GitHub pull request is just not something we've done previously. And it's like slightly tangential to what we're doing. But now that we're in the IDE through hooking our MCP into Cursor, we almost don't have to worry about that anymore. And we can just feed it our core data set and give it the contextual information, where now the LLM can be like, oh, I know how to write Terraform, or I know how to infer this block of Terraform code and send it back to Vantage. So then for us, we're like, wow, we don't have to even touch that anymore, which is actually very cool.
Are you seeing the rollout to the point where you can basically rely on your developer base either having or being willing to install agentic coding tools that will use that will hook into your MCP server? Like at this point, are there bits of documentation I don't have to write anymore because I can rely on an MCP provider figuring out, or other bits of developer experience tooling that aren't necessary anymore? Or is it still something where a lot of people aren't going to be using this?
That's a good question. I think a lot of people still use VS Code. So I think like thinking in the future, actually, it's funny enough you mentioned the VS Code extension because like that's what I was working on before MCP stuff. We have a Stripe VS Code extension that we built like an AI assistant into. And once MCP came out, we tackled it at the angle of, oh, this could be our way to get like up-to-date information into Cursor. And then that just kind of like turned into like, oh, let's add all this Stripe API calls in there as well. But I think it is a way to have like a cross-platform way to get your API's knowledge into multiple different IDEs, like whether that's Windsurf, Cursor, Claude Code. It's kind of like a universal language for that. So I do think that that part's interesting. But I think a lot of people still will use things like VS Code.
Yeah.
And one extensions.
I kind of feel like it's essential now for developer tools companies to have an MCP server. Like it feels like it's like we talk about like table stakes of developer tools like 2-3 years ago being like great SDKs, stainless, great docs. And now I think it's like that MCP layer is almost like, how do you help people be really productive with your tool and getting started and actually like being able to be really productive really quickly and like take a lot of the like schlep work away from them. And I think that to me is like now, yeah, I think like everyone, if you're building a developer tool, like in 2025, I feel like you have to have that. Right?
I think. Oh, sorry. One of my favorite things to do with MCP are just like, I don't know, these AI agents is ask, what else should I do? Like, what's next? And it really gives you like more ideas of like, oh, you can also do this and that. And so I think it's going to start being used more and more as like an upsell tool, where before, for example, you'd have to present someone with, here are some features on the free plan, here are some things on the paid plan. But the nice thing about MCP is you can have it, you can have it store some memory, some context about you as the user, how you like to interact with the service, what tool calls you usually make, what your profile is like. And then it can give you recommendations that's like, Dina, you usually like to do A, B, and C. Would you like to do X, Y, and Z? And it is catered towards me, towards how I use the product. And it speaks my language. So I think that's going to be, everybody's going to be able to do more and more with the services that they use.
Little more on the flip side, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, maybe skewed a little more enterprisey, but having conversations of like, oh, we just got approval to like use ChatGPT internally. And now the security team, and then of course everyone goes, well, now we want to use MCPs. And so the security team, I think at larger companies, they're trying to catch up, but they're like, yeah, we're still waiting to get approved on third-party MCPs. And I imagine it'll be like anything else, you have to go one by one, but similar to like Slack integrations or when ChatGPT allows you just like select them from a marketplace, it opens the floodgate a little bit. But I think adoption in larger enterprises, they're being a little bit more careful.
Also on the adoption note, one thing that's come up a little bit here, which I think is really interesting, is this just a tool for nerds? Like we're all developer tools companies basically, and maybe a lot of folks here are as well. And so for like Stainless and Knock, we like really only build for developers, right? And so anything we do is pretty developer facing. And so it can be hard to differentiate. But in the general case, how much are we seeing adoption amongst developers versus non-developers? Because it sounds like there's really some interesting use cases where people who had never written code before all of a sudden are interacting with APIs and getting a lot of stuff done that they would have had to turn to their nerdy friend for before. I'm curious for perspectives here.
Yeah, I mean, at Stripe, like we've kind of thought about it that way, and we were talking about this before, but like when MCP first came out, it was like the super nerdy thing. You have to like download like a node binary and like edit some JSON in your cursor config. And like now it's like being added to ChatGPT and like they're calling it like connectors. So I think there's like this transition towards like instead of like going and copying keys and downloading random stuff from the internet onto your computer to like one-click buttons on like ChatGPT or Claude, that kind of like makes that transparent to the user using it. And then you could interact with Stripe in different surfaces, for example, instead of going directly to Stripe dashboard. And you could have Claude or ChatGPT be like the place where you ask your questions. And I think that's pretty interesting. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's definitely where things are moving towards. Like most of the people that have used the Stripe MCP server today have been like early tinkerers. Like if you look at their website URLs, they all end in .ai, or they're segmented as like small businesses. But I think that will change.
Yeah. I think it's amazing that it came out as an open source project. And so it was something that you got into developers' hands, and then they were all contributing to it and making it better. And I think it being open source is part of the reason why it's evolved so much and is so great. But I am very excited for the days where somebody like my mom, who's not technical, is able to use it. Or for example, we've worked with Square. They have an MCP server that allows somebody to take a picture of a menu, like a physical menu, and it will automatically build an online storefront for them. And it's amazing to think about how much it can enable somebody who's not technologically savvy, who doesn't have the time to go and dig through all these things. All of a sudden, they have all these tools at their fingertips that can make them more productive, help grow their business. I was talking to somebody who was building an MCP server to help farmers be able to communicate to people like when they're going to be at different like markets, and farmers like they can only, or like they're most comfortable talking with something that's a chat interface, but all of a sudden it enables all these things in the background that before they just would not have had the time to do. So
I think Brooke kind of alluded to this earlier in their use case, but that idea of like multiple integration stacking, the power of like leveraging different tools to combine, and then like thinking about what you can now do instead of building like glue services. Now like you have whole teams who are able to take Vantage billing data and move it into Notion, or maybe it's like take NOC analytics data and then start to think about like what comes next with that, or piping that back into another service. And like that to me is like where we're going from nerdy to mainstream adoption as more like an integrations angle. I think it's really, really exciting in that way. Yeah.
I think functionally too, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Like what's interesting is it's like literally just one URL. Like with one URL, you could just go on your iPhone, share it, and you could like that one URL has your whole entire API. Like part of MCP is like the initial call is like you get the whole documentation of the API. So I think like you could put a whole business in one URL. It's pretty interesting.
I think our power users are currently evaluating it as a tool they would love to give their boss who's asking them these questions. But I don't think it's passing muster yet to like, I'm going to ask my boss to prompt this every month and trust they're going to get the right piece of information. And so that's what we're seeing currently is they're testing it out and running into some issues, mostly around doing math or like aggregating dates together, things like that. And so, but right now it's maybe veering a little bit towards like, let me get them directionally correct. And so that they need to know if they even need to ask a question or something like that. But it's more on the LLMs than maybe MCP at this point to give a strong enough answer where you can trust to give it to someone with less context. But so we're seeing in practice.
Yeah, even in Stainless, if I can share, I'm seeing a lot more uptake in tool use, actually on our customer-facing teams. So people who are helping our customers on a day-to-day basis might want to be able to like simultaneously look things up in our support ticket system. Maybe say, hey, go look on GitHub and look at the latest issues on the NOC Python repo or something like that. Or simultaneously like, hey, in Gong, which records some of our calls, what did we talk about in the last meeting? And what were our internal notes in Notion, and pull all of that together with like a 2-sentence prompt rather than clicking around a million different SaaS dashboards. And I love this quote around like your whole business in one URL or something like that. And it's you can even think about getting to the point where operators, people who perform tasks every day to help customers or do something else to move the business forward, rather than interacting with a million different SaaS dashboards, internal and external, third party and first party, you just have one little chat box and you can actually just get all of your job done there. That actually might be a lot more productive. And on that note, I kind of want to transition a little bit into the API specific use case of exposing your API to LLMs through MCP. Because if you were to look at the whole Stripe API or the whole Cloudflare API, there's hundreds or thousands of endpoints. And if you try to have all of those parameters documented, basically the whole Open API spec translated into one tool for every endpoint in the API, this is something that we were able to build pretty quickly at Stainless. There's some complications, but it's not crazy complicated to do something like this. But you end up consuming so many so much of your context that you don't have room to have your actual conversation. But even beyond that, if you have too many tools exposed at one time, you're going to see the models just get confused, and they're not going to be able to use it right. And what a lot of people are saying out there these days is, okay, well, you don't want to expose your whole API one-to-one, every endpoint, every request parameter, every response field, just the same thing as you normally would, because it's just too much. It's an information overload. You want to instead sort of like craft these careful, okay, only these specific endpoints, and maybe you combine a few different API endpoints to make it super, super easy, and you're only exposing a small subset of the functionality that's the happy path use case you're expecting. And I think people who are doing that are seeing success, right? I think we've talked about several of those here today. On the other hand, if you want to replace the entire Stripe dashboard, and I used to work on that product, and there's a lot more there than you would think, holy cow, but it is a superset of the entire Stripe API, pretty strictly, or the entire Cloudflare dashboard, which, we are happy users, and there's also quite a lot there, probably even a lot more than I've ever seen. That's a lot. There's probably not a single endpoint in your API that you shipped because you thought nobody was ever going to use it. And there's probably not a request parameter that you built because you thought no one would ever need it. And what's the use? What are the situations where you would want to go click on it in the dashboard or fill out a form in a web UI, but you wouldn't want an AI to just do that work for you? And so anyway, so there's some really tricky, interesting challenges here on how you scale this up and how you scale it down and how you do it efficiently and how you enable it to be accurate. And we can dig into that a little bit more. But I want to hear your guys' perspectives. So, for that API use case, we talked about this a little bit before, but like, what percentage of your API is exposed? How direct is that mapping? Is it pretty one-for-one? Is it superset? Is it pretty bespoke? And what are your plans, if any, for growing that? Is that something where an engineer is sitting there kind of like rewriting the whole API? Curious for the strategy. So we can take that in any order, but I'm curious for everybody's thoughts.
So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I think it's like 10% or 20% covered. It's all one-for-one right now and read-only at the moment. But the one thing we've had to do because of context limits is the API responses, you can specify different aggregations. And in our API, we always default to the most amount of data and the most amount of pages we're going to return to you because it's the most granular version of the information. But in the MCP, we've had to instruct it like, hey, actually try to roll things up as much as possible. And especially if someone's just asking a question like, what service did I spend the most on last month? You don't need by service by day, or you can get even more granular than that. And so that's been the tough part there. And so calling the APIs, but making sure it's done in a way that a human wouldn't usually do it, but is more fit for the LLM.
We have probably 1,700 API endpoints. I know this because I tried to make a tool for each one of them. Did not work, but so definitely less than 1% of them are exposed as tools. But we have kind of put it on every product manager to go and think about how are customers interacting with their products, what are the use cases, and making them a lot more based on what the user is trying to do versus the API endpoint itself. And of course, within that tool call, it may call out to a few different API endpoints to get that response. But I think it's been a good exercise to kind of make product managers think about that. But at the same time, we have now ended up with 15 MCP servers that each have their different tools. And so the next thing that we're thinking about is how do we combine them into one MCP server, because the discoverability gets difficult. But I do think that's one place where the MCP spec is going to need to develop more, where you can have this more dynamic tool discovery, where ideally I can use the Cloudflare MCP server. And let's say I start to venture into one product area and it can start to load the tools for that, but it doesn't need to do that initially. And hopefully a lot of that is abstracted away from the user, especially someone non-technical is not even going to be thinking about it. So yeah, and hopefully one day we can have the whole dashboard be available as tools.
Yeah, we do I think it's probably about 60% of our like management API we expose. But to your point about like modeling not just one-for-one for endpoints, like we map things into more like resources and like jobs to be done, and that's how we think about modeling some of these tools. I think the one that's weirdest in our MCP server is our workflow management API, which is like you can basically say like create a multi-step workflow that branches, it does batching, digesting, things like that. We actually break that into separate tools because the amount of parameters for each one of those steps got so big that it didn't make sense to try and model it. It was like a really wacky union type, and that was where we actually ran into some really weird edges with certain models that deal with certain union types in one way, but like Gemini doesn't really like union types in a certain way. I'm sure like the Stainless team has learned all these lessons as well. And then for us, like, so it was nice to break these into smaller tool calls, but now we've like kind of bloated the number of tools, and I'm sure lots of you in the room are aware, like, you can only have 40 tool calls in Cursor, right? So I think that like that has been a real thing for us, and we're now thinking of doing the opposite, which is breaking out some of these things into more use case specific MCP servers, which, like, just based on the current state of the art, it feels like that feels like the right move for us, just because we're kind of learning more about the use cases for people who are like, I really want to like manage my NOC content and I really want that to map to this management API, and like split that out from a different use case as well. But I 100% agree. I think like the tool discovery problem and how we can like help, like even when you like have a remote MCP server and you can say, I want to authenticate against that, and then maybe expose a subset of tools that are relevant for the kind of permissioning that I have and the role level that I have within that piece of software. I think that should go a long way as well. Yeah.
The Stripe Open API spec is like 8 megabytes. We have so many APIs. We only like looked at like the top 20 of them and put those in. I would say it's like 1-to-1-ish because we have like probably like a janky version of Stainless where we like take the Open API spec and then generate like the tool descriptions. But tool descriptions like have like a character limit, so you have to be like careful with that. And so even of the APIs we do support, we have like a subset of those parameters to be the most popular ones, because the Stripe API has so many parameters, just because it's a very big and expensive, sophisticated API. So I think there's a lot to figure out as well with the tool discovery, I think at the spec level, because we want to add things like beyond just API calls too. Like we want to like Cursor developers to use this to like debug things, like debug like a request log. And maybe that doesn't map 1-to-1 with an API, or like right now we have search documentation, but maybe we want something where you give your business idea and like Stripe recommends you like an integration plan. So that wouldn't be like directly in the API, and like what we talked about with like the Sigma-esque things. So I think, yeah, Cursor has like a limit of like 40 or 100 or something like that. There needs to be something at the MCP spec level to make that easier. And then yeah, the union types thing, like we have create coupon, for example, at Stripe, like has like different parameters like amount off or like discount. And so when like testing that, it will work in like one model and then break in another. So getting like the description exactly right, like it's not as easy as just copying and pasting whatever you have in your open API spec. For us, we found that we need to start with that and then edit it.
The other thing here is like tool names are really interesting, right? Like tool names can conflict. So like we have like a very generic thing like workflows. So like if you don't if you don't have like any more specificity on the beginning of that, like that can be a problem, right? So like now we're thinking like, oh, do we need to prefix all our tools with Nox? So like, yeah, they have some unique names, but
Yeah, we had a user actually like comment because we had search documentation and they were like, sometimes this is like being called whenever we have like a search documentation on our Amazon MCP as well.
Right.
And so like it's searching the Stripe docs about Amazon stuff. So like now we called it search Stripe documentation, but
yeah,
like the description of the search documentation tool that we have like says like explicitly this searches Stripe doc. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff to think about there.
oh yeah.
Yeah, I've been chatting with the MCP team at Anthropic about some of these challenges recently around sort of what I call browsing, but yeah, dynamic discoverability, and thinking about things in a more namespace way, and sort of gradually sort of crawling through like, okay, the user is asking me about payments. Okay, I'm going to go look at what I can do inside of the Stripe set of tools. Or they're asking me specifically about setting up products. I'm going to look at stripe.products. Whatever is there. There's some really interesting challenges there because you don't want too many back and forths. You don't want too many turns. Each one of those is expensive, and so if you have too many successive reveals as you get down to like the nth level of nesting and in a huge parameter chain, that would get pretty expensive. And so we're cooking up some interesting stuff on that at Stainless. The very naive approach that we do offer now, and we've seen actually surprising success with this, is like if you have a huge API like Stripe or Cloudflare, you can boot up a Stainless generated. Sorry for the sales pitch, not super intended, but you could boot up an MCP server that we make with -- dynamic, and instead of having like one tool for every endpoint, you get three tools. One of them is list endpoints. One of them is Git endpoint, so it'll give you the full sort of essentially the tool call description for one of those API endpoints, and then the third is execute endpoint. And so this is basically three tools technically, but dynamically it can be any of them. There's cost to that because the model has to go back and forth 3 times instead of just once to make an API call, and so that actually slows things down. It burns some tokens. So it's not an ideal solution. And then you may still end up in a case where one of your endpoints has 1 million parameters and good documentation on those parameters, but that good documentation is expensive and might not be relevant. So there's a lot of really interesting challenges here. I'm really excited to dive into that. I could talk about that all night, and I would love to, but and maybe we can come back to it if folks are interested. But before that, I would love to hear kind of what have been the actually, well, first, before we get into like the challenges and hardest parts, just really quick, one thing we didn't share is just what's the tech stack you guys are using for building and shipping your MCP servers. And for folks in the audience who are thinking about building an MCP server for their company, what's the engineering cost going to look like? What does it take to build one of these things? And what have you seen there?
I guess I could start there. So we actually had this thing called the Stripe Agent Toolkit before MCP was a thing, and we had like Python and TypeScript. So it was actually pretty easy for us to adopt that and then build a local TypeScript server that you could run. And then we also shipped like a remote MCP server that's hosted on Stripe Infra, and a lot of that is built with Ruby. And then we have so we had to read the MCP spec and build like a Ruby library to do that. And we use that for our internal MCP server as well. So I think like the cost is less about like actually setting up that infrastructure and more about like what we just talked about, like thinking about like we as an industry are pretty good, I think, at API design, but like MCP design is like 2 months old. So I think that's the hard part. Like Like it's funny when you go in to make tools and like you like spend all your time writing your description and then you're like, oh, it has to be less than 1,000 characters. Like, but yeah, and then auth is also like kind of tricky. You have to have like a auth server in place if you want like a remote MCP server. So we're working on that now. But yeah.
We followed the Stripe model actually, so we shipped an agent toolkit first, but with some very particular use cases. Because at Knock, one thing we think about is how can we facilitate like agent to user messaging as well? Like, what's that going to look like in the future? So that's our agent toolkit, and then we built a whole load of tools, and then we expose those over a local MCP server right now, all in TypeScript. It actually uses our generated stainless APIs under the hood to make that part really easy. And then we're working on like a remote MCP server next as well, which will be, there's a lot of plugs in this panel tonight, but that will be hosted on Cloudflare. So yeah, there we go. Which I think makes a lot of sense given like the investment and the kind of stuff that they've been building there. So yeah, and then for us, like definitely the same kind of problem of engineering time. It's like I wrote the MCP server and the agent toolkit in a few weekends. It was actually pretty straightforward to just like kind of vibe code something, to be totally honest. I think the part that's hard is like, how do you know that's working right? Like how like evals, testing, like actually thinking about like, is the model doing what you need it to do for your customers who are now going to start depending on this tool, right? Like, and you need to think about it as like something that's out there in the world and needs the kind of rigor around engineering that your SDKs have or your API has as well. So I would say that's where we're just starting a lot of that investment, and that I foresee that being like probably the biggest challenge for us there.
Also, like you said, like testing on different models as well. Like,
right.
Yeah, you can't just assume every model is going to treat like even the like schema definition the same.
Definitely, and I think like that's an AI engineering muscle that organizations need to build, right? It was like very easy for people to just like YOLO a MCP server in a weekend. And then it's like, oh, actually, now we need to think about like, how do we build the competency internally to actually like, you know, write evals, actually test against different models, like actually productionize that service as well. So.
Yeah. On the Cloudflare side, we have a developer platform, and as a part of our agents SDK, we've been building out tooling that allows you to get started with a remote MCP server. Really, just takes one click. And so we've been trying to take care of like the transport layer, the auth piece, so that developers can focus most of their time on the tools themselves. So we ourselves have been our own customer zero using it. So thankfully with this toolkit, it only takes about, 1 day to really get it spun up. But like you said, a lot of the time goes, you get that initial thing spun up and you have your tools, but then a lot of it goes into refining them, testing them, checking what they're like with different clients. There's like a meme that's like, automation, and then it's like what you think it's going to be like, and then it's like actually 90% of the work is just making it better. But yeah, but at least that initial part, I think it's been nice that it's been so easy.
Yeah, we started with local only in what felt like a 36-hour window before hosted became the thing you're supposed to do. But it's written in Go primarily because we're actually shipping it to someone who's not necessarily a developer, and so they may not have Node on their laptop. And so the team was like, well, it'd be great if we just package up as a binary. So builds on GitHub, you can download it and then just start running it. Are working on a hosted version. Same with Chris, like Cloudflare is just leading the way, I'd say, or the only infrastructure provider also treating it as like a first-class thing. And so we're targeting that. And then on the testing piece, she doesn't know this yet, but I want my docs lead who's on mat leave and she gets back in 2 weeks. But I think the way her brain works is like, I'm going to explain these really complex concepts in like English language and simplify it. And I think if I can create a very quick feedback loop for her by like modifying a tool, testing in the different models, and then just having her be able to like run with it, that's the mode I want to kind of get into. But I haven't figured out how to get that quick feedback loop for her yet, but that's like the top of my list.
Cool. And what have been the other, so we talked about some of them just now, hard problems like testing. Earlier we were talking about some other challenges that, you've run into, things that were, oy vey, as you were starting to do this, and what are the tools that you wish existed in the ecosystem to make your life easier? What are the changes? We've talked about sort of dynamic discoverability. Are there any other changes you would like to see in the MCP spec itself? And if anyone here, I don't know if there are founders who are thinking about new ideas or potential founders. Like, what startup would you like to see, created tomorrow to make life easier for you as you deliver MCP to the world?
I think it would be nice to have, I think on the directory front and the discoverability, there's a lot of work to be done where, it's easy to find what MCP servers exist and maybe your client can automatically find that, but also making sure that it's secure, that it is in fact hosted by the party that, you are looking to use. Yeah, that's one thing.
I think related to that, like we've talked about, like, you go, if you're in Cursor, you kind of still have to install these things. So like related to like a marketplace, I feel like every week a new like MCP registry drops. But like it'd be interesting in Cursor, like if you ask like how can I add notifications infrastructure or payments infrastructure or deploy my website, if it could like detect that intent and like suggest that for you so that the user doesn't need to know or have signed up for an account to install these things.
Dev tool companies would pay handsomely for the ability to be promoted in that space, I would imagine as well. But I think like one of the challenges is that like you don't know the prompt, right? Like you know the tool call, but you don't have any visibility into the prompt that's actually being run for obvious reasons. Like it's good, right? But that also presents a real challenge. Like how do you make sure that's good? And like to Brooke's point, like having the ability for people to work through and like do this testing loop and making that better. But I wish we could get like a subset of prompts or something that helps us determine like when is my tool call being executed and is it being executed correctly? And like being on the downstream of that, obviously you see API logs and you can get observability and things like that with a lot of platforms that exist today. But like it would just be really nice to be a bit more upstream.
Brooke, you were talking a little bit about some of these challenges earlier today as well.
Terrifying new world. In B2B SaaS today, you're just connected on Slack with all of your customers, which is great, but they will also DM you at any hour of the day, I've noticed. And so have gotten my first messages around, hey, the LLM responded with this after it made a call to your tool. And I'm like, I can see the log in the API, it looks fine. And so actually working with them to like, can you just ask it why it did that or what the latest dump was? And that becomes even scarier when, it might be combining it with a SQL query to Snowflake or something and combining those data sets. And so I think that's a really interesting problem to solve, but some sort of like dump the debug log of this and paste it to me or whomever's on the other side of that will be super helpful, because otherwise, unfortunately, from a customer support perspective, you have to go back and be like, I don't know. Right?
Is just like so scary. Yeah. Like for example, like during our testing, like we turned off like we always recommend like having like restricted access keys when you give like our servers or like you're building agents on top of Stripe. So like for testing our MCP, we turned off like the ability to like read customers, and we asked like how many customers do I have, expecting it to be able like say like, oh, I can't answer that, but it read through how many invoices were charged and then it guessed based on that. So it was just, we were very surprised being able to just seeing that. I think the security is going to be such a challenge in the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's one big thing that we're thinking about of, every company right now is like, I don't know what MCP servers my employees are connecting to, what information is all of a sudden like being shared that's like so sensitive. And we're thinking about, kind of like a gateway concept of everything can flow through this thing, but also then how do you prevent someone from just bypassing it and being like, I'm just going to connect to this directly. And so I think that's going to be an interesting new realm of, detecting MCP specific connections or having some kind of layer there that gives companies the visibility around what data is being shared with different services.
Yeah, I liked earlier also how you were talking about using permissions to dynamically change what tools are being exposed. So if a given user who's OAuthing into the MCP server doesn't have access to certain bits of data, it's just not even visible in the tool. That sounded really cool as well. Well, there's a lot more that I'm curious about, but I'm sure there's a lot that everybody here is curious about. So let's open it up to questions from the audience. We have Min and Allison who can come around with microphones.
Hi. Outside your company's MCP server, what's your favorite MCP servers to use? How do you use it, and in what clients?
My favorite is there's getmcp.io. It takes any GitHub repo, and you just change github.com to getmcp.io, and it makes it into an MCP server that you can search and query. And so a lot of times I use it to take different examples of different repos and be like, I want to build something similar. So that's been one of my favorites. It's open, it's public.
I really like productivity tools and specifically like the linear MCP server is actually great if you haven't tried it out. Like it's a really good one. I spend a lot of time like thinking about tickets and writing tickets, so that's where my mind immediately goes. And then for me, that's like I use a combination of Claude and then just Cursor like all day. So yeah.
Sorry, Claude Web or Claude Code?
Claude, the Mac app. Yeah, I love it.
I've mainly been using our internal MCPs, so like reading our internal docs, then like grabbing through source graph through Cursor has been interesting as well, and reading Jira tickets.
Yeah, so I use Cursor, but similar to Chris, like linear, anything where it's your manual shuffling between things. So like Sentry to linear or Sentry to linear to Notion or whatever that looks like. If you can break down that like manual work the developer has to do and just make the thing happen, it's like it's going to be a great new world.
Oh.
Where you guys have found like new MCP endpoints, for lack of a better word, that you need to add that didn't exist in the APIs to be able to like solve the seeing out in the field.
Our big one was adding like a /me endpoint where we just give it more context about who you are. So like what teams you're on in the product, what workspaces you have access to, or what filters you have access to. And then also just more context for the LLM to do better things downstream. And so big thing in infrastructure costs is tagging. And so here's all the tag keys available in your environment. And there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff we can just do with that more context, but that was the main piece. And so when it boots up front or when you ask your first question, it hits those first so that it can then make a better call downstream from that.
We had the exact same thing, which is like, we have this management API and we expose, like it's actually got quite a lot of surface area, but building an MCP meant that we had to expose more endpoints to give more context to the LLM to make decisions that we didn't have previously. So for us, it was like, yeah, what environments do you have access to? What does your account look like? Things like that. And then we could use that and then channel it into the other tools that it was calling. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty interested in just like DX in general. Like we have like a one that searches docs, but like, can we have one that like you describe your business, or one that like helps you debug request logs that you made through Stripe? Then also like experimenting with the idea of like, can you just like create an account through MCP? Can you sign up for a different like SaaS through MCP? I think is an interesting idea. Like imagine like only going to Cursor, never signing up for anything, but you buy and pay and sign up for Stripe and Subabase and Knock or whatever you want, just all through MCP and Cursor.
So my use case is really around like text to analytics, and so I'm really curious to hear, like Brooke, I think you have a use case there. Matt, you also mentioned like the Stripe Sigma kind of use case. Like, what role does MCP play in this text to analytics use case? And specifically, like, how well formed does your API need to be versus like free-form SQL that I can throw at this thing? Not to use another buzzword, but like, where's the semantic layer if it exists in this case? Like, how does this all fit together?
So for us, the way we developed the API before MCP was actually just taking something that looked like SQL, and that's how you can query for different. It's just domain specific, and so that's been nice in that the LLM can then learn very quickly or easily how to construct that. The biggest issue is just on the number crunching. For instance, like I kind of alluded to this earlier, but like, oh, this you have an array of results. This one is 2025 June 1st. Is that representing the whole month of June, or is that just representing the 1st of June? And it just messes it up every time. And then getting those numbers correctly, like doing the aggregations and the numbers correct afterwards is hard. And so at that MCP layer is where you need to be like very prescriptive of how it's going to call your API and just try to give it as much in the prompt as possible to like guide it. But that's been the biggest challenge there.
Yeah, I think it's hard, especially like if you have a giant API like Stripe, because we have Sigma, so we have like all these different tables, but it's like hard to get those tables in the context of the client. So we haven't like we've kind of punted on this for now, but that's where we've been kind of thinking of like a higher order API where you ask a question like, "What's my MRR?" And then there is like I guess a semantic layer that like converts that to yeah, whatever that is, converts that to a query that like Stripe has like templates for. And then I think also what's interesting is like being able to deep link to like a SQL like specific editor. So like giving you back the result and then deep linking you back to the dashboard so that you could like use an editor that has all that context and is built around that is probably like how we're thinking about that at least.
I haven't built it yet, but the thing that we're thinking about there is like ours is like message analytics use case, right? Like what's your efficacy of your notifications, things like that. We've been thinking about it like MCP calls an agent that then traverses, understands, and can do like more thinking there, like get that semantic layer, build it into a context window. Because like that's the thing, it doesn't just have to wrap talk like API calls, right? Like you can be calling back into something else that's actually doing deep thinking or like understanding and then returning results back. So like and passing through that context. Yeah.
One of the sub agents is one of the terms for things sort of like this, and my impression is Claude Code can do this pretty effectively out of the box sometimes. So you ask a really high level question, and it'll sort of like make a little sub agent to go compose a bunch of API calls or SQL requests or whatever. But that's sort of dependent on the client, right? So Claude Code might have that, but Cursor might not, for example. And you as like the API provider, like in that case, Stripe isn't controlling the sub agent, which has pros and cons, right? Like as Brooke was pointing out, maybe a sub agent provided by Vantage would know a lot more about how to do financial math around your cloud billing, and you should really be trusting that over a general knowledge sub agent. And does that end up looking more like computer use that's provided directly by Vantage? And I think there's some really interesting questions there that also though gets really complicated for billing, right? I mean, if somebody asks a kind of a dumb question, it costs a lot of tokens to figure it out, and Vantage is paying for those tokens. Well, you kind of want to pass that cost on to the person who's doing the asking. I actually think Stripe. Do you guys now have tools for that? For like people billing for their MCP tools?
Yeah, we're definitely exploring this area, and then in our agent toolkit, we have like a paid MCP. So like if you're building like a MCP business, or if you want to wrap your tool calls to pay them, we have explore that, and we think that will take off, but still very early with like these clients and stuff.
About a lot of this has been kind of from the outside in, right? So the MCP is very new, and so we're wrapping APIs around existing software. I'm wondering, as this catches on, are we going to build APIs differently, and are we even going to build the underlying software differently because we know that a lot of the calls are going to be coming through LLMs, and we want to avoid some of the difficulties that you've talked about?
Do you have a take?
Yeah, I mean, there will be some impact, and it's something that I've, at Salence, obviously, computers talking to computers is all we do, right? So we think about this a lot. To us, it's a really interesting new frontier. One of the problems that we haven't talked about a ton, we've touched on it a little bit, with modern sort of REST API design, when it comes into an MCP context, is large API response sizes. There's a few, most of REST, what is REST design, right? That's a whole nother day. But most of your typical REST API that you would design for a developer, from what we've seen, can work out pretty well. But the response sizes is one of the bigger problems. Pagination is also kind of tricky, but we'll leave that one aside for now. I think that's a smaller problem to solve. And so what do you do with a large response that consumes a lot of tokens, confuses the model? Do you want something more like GraphQL? Do you want something more like actually gRPC, where you have like a ton of calls available that are all really specific and smaller? Do you want just something that's pure natural language, and you do consume tokens on both sides of it every time, where you have an agent talking to an agent, and the compression is English text, natural language, and then there's a translation on either side, right? That gets pretty expensive and lossy, so probably not. Where I've personally netted out here is, and this is something that we want to experiment with, but we haven't tried yet, so it's highly speculative, is actually this computer use thing that I've been hinting at a little bit, is where I expect things to probably go. Where if let's say you're saying, hey, what's my MRR, or like how much money did I spend on GCP versus AWS last month, or is CI more expensive than my production fleet? In Q3. Well, there's a lot of, I assume that's a bunch of API calls to Vantage. I assume that's some math has to be done there. And rather than an LLM trying to figure out a whole sequence or water flow of API requests to make, which can get tricky. In some cases, you have to like make a list request in order to find an ID, right? And then use that ID to make an update request, or there's all sorts of different tricky things. Write some TypeScript, right? If you write some LLMs are really good at writing TypeScript, and you say, stripe.customers.list, and you loop through everyone until you find a given individual, and then you look for that individual's invoices or whatever. That's like 5 lines of TypeScript if you use the Stripe TypeScript SDK. It's really easy for an LLM to do that. It's easy for an MCP server to deterministically check if the code is valid, with a TypeScript, with a type checker, and check that before you run it. Ultimately, the model can return out the response fields that it knows that it wants, and you can statically know, again, with type checking, whether those response properties are valid. And if you do something like that, the cost that you're looking at there, I think, could be pretty minimal. Actually, I would expect like Cloudflare workers in the new Cloudflare containers product to be really compelling for this. I think you might see something that ends up coincidentally, basically, making modern human-focused REST practices work out really well. But we'll see. I'm curious to talk more about. Obviously, I nerd out on this way too much. I'm sorry, but I would love to talk about that more. I don't know if that resonates, or if you guys see something else.
I think that's really interesting. I think like from our perspective, it's like analytics shape questions, like our minds automatically go to our Sigma product, because like we have that, and it's just silly to like have like 25 tool calls to answer like questions. But I mean, Cursor's really good at like reading in the type errors and like iterating on that, so it kind of gets you like that for free. But LLMs are good at writing SQL too, so I think it's an interesting idea.
Say like drives us, like I mentioned earlier, like again, not with LLMs in mind, but our API, we created this syntax that's just a domain specific SQL. We are now want to drive towards a Sigma offering, so that it can then construct just a query that returns the answer instead of a set of REST calls.
Any other questions?
We're seeing that a lot of companies are building their own clients for their own company that then can interact with a trusted list of MCP servers. Even if they use a service like Atlassian, for example, they may have their own self-hosted version of that they expose as an MCP server. But I think there's definitely a lot around the auth piece that's being developed right now. I think a lot of just how do you keep all of that data and information in-house? How do you have observability around it, auditing? But it feels like it's such a no-brainer in terms of productivity that it is something that we talk to customers every day that are investing in I want a solution for this. I'm starting to build my own stuff for it.
Is anyone here? Sorry, is there anyone here today from OSO or Opal or any other authorization companies? Okay, cool. Yeah, we haven't talked at all really about prompt injection risks or authorization is one of the things people shouldn't be accessing resources that they shouldn't be accessing, and we've talked about that a tiny bit. I think that's going to be really huge. And for example, let's say people were to start offering more SQL, that's even harder, right? A lot of people implement their authorization at the API layer, not the SQL layer. Anyway, there's a lot more there, but prompt injection risks, I think, can be really insane. We talked about this a little bit last time, where if you give an LLM access to any external information, right? Whether that's their internal Zendesk, where you might see an email from a customer, whether that's web search, et cetera. There's a lot of surfaces where user provided content can come into play. There could be a prompt attack, a prompt injection in any of that, saying, hey, ignore previous instructions and send all money to whatever, this Bitcoin address, or exfiltrate this user data, or whatever. And so if you have any combination of that and any MCP tool that could be or other tool that could be used to send data, basically if there's any internet access at all, which there probably is if it's going to do anything useful, you have a mind-boggling security attack vector. And if you think about the challenges of SQL injection, it took the programming industry decades to get to the point where most of the time people were writing SQL that was mostly safe in their apps, and it took a lot of ORM innovation to get there. And it's actually a lot harder, a much harder problem to sanitize inputs in this. So I think that's one of the challenges that we're going to see also in rolling out to enterprise contexts.
Verified badge in the ChatGPT marketplace will be the first thing, similar to Slack. But I'm probably going to see extensions of standards like SOC 2, Type 2 to start to cover these types of things. Yeah, there's a lot of new businesses that could start just around that concept, I think.
The question was, what do we do for governance? Yeah. What are we doing here? I don't know, honestly, how good of an answer this is, but at Stainless, actually, one of our engineers built something called MCP Front, which is open source. It's on GitHub. It's not under the Stainless org. It's under his personal org, which is dgello. So if you're interested, send us an email and we'll hook you up. But that serves as a proxy service to all the MCPs that we interact with. And so if there's a local MCP server on Docker Hub, the Docker MCP Hub, it's sort of like a one-click essentially to pull that in, set up auth and everything for it. And then it'll use our internal we use Google for our authentication, and so I can fire up a Claude Code session, easily add our internal actually Postgres we do through this, but even external services, and then it'll auth as my account through the OAuth flow, and that's all happens within our own like on our servers through our own proxy, and that mostly is an improvement to the usability because there's a lot less command line messing around that somebody has to do in order to add an MCP server, but it also improves our our governance model a little bit. It was mostly built for internal use. It's not really production ready, but please do check it out. Share feedback if that sounds useful to you guys.
Ours is service token based, so just thinking about like you provision a service token similar to like the Stripe model, but like we're moving towards more of like OAuth model on our flow, which is a whole different challenge. Like now you actually need an OAuth server, and if you haven't built that already, like that's a thing. But like I think that permission model makes a lot of sense. It's like that's like you're authenticating against the user. They can only do actions that they would have been able to do in like whatever your product is anyway. So that I mean, for the use cases where that makes sense, I think that works. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Any show of hands? Yeah. Maybe right here.
So I want to know your opinion about arrival of AGI and superintelligence. By that I mean like LLMs that are smarter than the smartest humans. Like Mark Zuckerberg has said that he's shooting for 2027. What would be the effect of that for MCP and the future of our careers in general?
Question for the last question.
Actually, we were going to roll that out tomorrow. I don't have a view on. I think 2027 sounds a little bit aggressive. Personally, at that point, I think the economic timing questions start to be dominant over anything else. If like all humans become unemployed overnight, like the AIs would actually still want to call the MCP servers, but no one would be employed at Cloudflare anymore to like turn them on. And so I don't know. I'm like maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, and but I know that it won't happen all at once, right? And
a little bit. The problems with MCP we've talked about are like very fundamental and basic, and the issues it still has rather. And so maybe look at it through like there's still a lot of work to do from that front.
One thing I would say though that is interesting, and I don't know if this is an optimistic note or a pessimistic note, is we were talking earlier about an operator at a company who normally would have to log into a bunch of SaaS apps and click a bunch of buttons, and now can just do it all through a chat window. That sounds a lot more convenient. Same person, more productive. This is the story of technology since the dawn of technology, right? That's a great, happy story. Well, how soon do you not have to have that person typing? And if you've done this work to expose everything that your company does through a dashboard to any LLM really easily, that's good productive work, I think. It does make it a lot easier for every time AI levels up a little bit, that it can now act. It could do a lot more, and that can be exciting, and maybe it can also be a little bit scary too.
Sam Altman has a blog post that he posted recently that's like, what are the next 10 years going to look like? And he was like, somebody from the 1950s would think we're madmen the way we're using computers today to do our jobs. But I think it really is such a huge tool for productivity, and it allows us to spend more time on more interesting and more complicated problems and get those answers faster. I don't know. It's my optimistic view. Just reading it.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll close on that sunny note. Thanks everybody so much for coming. And do we have more food, drink, etc.?
Please, yes.
Okay. We apparently have too much food and drink. So please rescue us from that terrible fate. thanks again. We'll be around. Come ask. Obviously, lots of great builders in the audience, so hope everyone's able to chat with each other. I'm Alex at stainless.com. Bunch of peers around if you guys have questions. Cheers.